Hands where I can see them, or I swear I'll paint this veranda with your brains. The words struck the quiet Sunday like a hammer breaking glass. Officer Ryan Caldwell's voice didn't shake. It slashed through the magnolia-scented air with a certainty born from hate, not fear. He had his gun jammed so tight against Ethan Harlow's temple that the metal left a cold circle on his skin. Ethan didn't move. He had been sitting with the Charlotte Observer folded across his lap, the kind of stillness a man earns after years of chaos. The coffee on the table was still steaming. The magnolia blossoms drifting across the lawn were still settling. But Caldwell's pulse was already racing, already feeding the anger he carried in his bones. Detective Marcus Hale stood behind him, hands on his duty belt, trying, half-heartedly, to look like he wasn't enjoying this. They had seen a black man sitting on the veranda of a $1.8 million house in Pinecrest Heights. They didn't ask questions. They didn't knock. They didn't wait. They acted as if the house itself had been robbed simply by Ethan's presence, and for a long beat. The only sound in that perfect neighborhood was Caldwell's breathing, heavy, wet, hungry. Before diving deeper into this story, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and while you're here, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps more than you know. Sophia Harlow stepped into the doorway a second later, still wearing the soft house robe she'd tied over her pajamas. Her hair wasn't brushed yet. She looked like a woman who had woken up believing the world was safe. She carried a hand on her belly the way expectant mothers do without thinking, a quiet promise of the life growing inside her. When she saw the gun pressed to her husband's head, she froze. Not the stiff kind of freeze, but the silent, breathless collapse of a person whose mind suddenly detaches from her body. Her face turned white. The mug slipped from her hand and shattered at her feet. Ethan. His name barely made it out. Her knees buckled before either man on the porch could react. Ethan moved first, not toward Caldwell, but toward Sophia. Caldwell interpreted it as defiance and shoved the barrel harder into Ethan's skull. I said, "Don't move." His voice cracked, not from fear, but from a high that rode the edge of whatever pills he'd swallowed that morning. Hale shifted uneasily, glancing down the street as if expecting someone to come out and applaud. They always acted bolder in Pinecrest Heights. The neighborhood made them feel untouchable. Ethan kept his palms open as he knelt beside his wife. Sophia's breath came in shallow, rapid waves. Her fingers trembled against her stomach. There was a spreading warmth beneath her robe that told Ethan everything he didn't want to know. Pain tightened her face, not sharp, but deep and wrong. "Stay with me," Ethan whispered, his voice low, steady, and terrifyingly calm for a man with a gun at his head. "Sophia, look at me." She blinked once, then again, slower. The world behind her eyes dimmed. Caldwell barked something Ethan didn't even register. Hale stepped closer, maybe to check vitals, maybe to pretend he cared. Ethan didn't give them the satisfaction of panic. He knew panic. Panic took lives. And in that moment, he needed to stay alive for the woman in front of him, even as the truth settled between them like a stone dropped in water. The miscarriage had begun. On the veranda, they bought to build a future. On the wood, Sophia helped design. Under the magnolias, she picked during their first walk through the neighborhood when everything felt possible. Ethan closed his eyes, not because he was afraid, but because the grief hit him with the precision of a bullet. He opened them again with something colder behind them. "You don't belong here," Caldwell spat, pacing like a wolf circling a kill. "This neighborhood isn't for people like you. So tell me how you got this house." His finger tightened on the trigger, the way addicts tighten their grip when the high starts fading. "Tell me or I'll. You'll do exactly what you've always done," Ethan said. Voice level, tone steady as a judge's gavel. Hurt whoever you can get away with. Hale stiffened. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition or shame or memory. Caldwell didn't catch it. He was too far gone. Sophia whimpered, barely audible. A sound that broke something deep inside Ethan. He pressed his hand gently over hers, feeling the life slipping away before it ever had a chance to form. He had seen men die. He had held dying partners in back alleys, but nothing in his years with the Bureau had prepared him for the look in Sophia's eyes as she realized their child was gone. Caldwell didn't see it. He didn't care to. To him, the pain unfolding in front of him was incidental, collateral, expected. It was the price of order as he defined it. White, wealthy, controlled. He thought Ethan was just another man he could break. Ethan reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately. Caldwell jerked his gun upward. Ready to fire. Don't! Hale warned under his breath, sensing something in Ethan that didn't fit the script, but Ethan wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pulled out his phone, pressed 3 numbers, and lifted it to his ear. His voice, when he spoke, was so calm that the dispatcher later admitted it chilled her more than any scream could have. This is Special Agent Ethan Harlow with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He said, I'm at my residence in Pinecrest Heights. 2 officers just held me at gunpoint without cause. My wife is pregnant. She's bleeding. Send medical and send command. He paused, then added in a tone that made the dispatcher's breath hitch. And record this line. I want everything preserved. Hale swore under his breath. Caldwell shouted something incoherent. Sophia went still. Ethan did not look at Caldwell again. He looked at his wife, memorizing her breaths, her fear, her fading hope, and in the quiet agony of that morning. Ethan made another call, an unspoken one, deep in the part of his soul that had survived too much loss already. He called back the man he used to be, the man who trusted systems that failed him, the man who believed justice could be shaped, sharpened, and deployed like a blade, because after today, someone would bleed for this, and it would not be him. Ethan Harlow had once believed in badges the way some men believed in scripture. But that faith died the night his partner bled out in the back of a rotting Atlanta alley, while squad cars from the local precinct idled a block away and never came. The memory still lived inside him like a bruise that refused to fade. He could still see the rain running down his partner's face, the flickering neon from a liquor store sign reflecting in the widening pool beneath him, the way the young officer kept whispering, "They'll come. Ethan, they'll come," as if saying it could will the universe into decency. But no one came. Not the responding units logged into the system. Not the sergeant who pretended later that the call never went through. Not the narcotics lieutenant who conveniently lost the body cam footage showing which officers were near the scene. The next morning, the entire case file evaporated. Evidence lockers were suddenly empty. The shooter's name disappeared from the system. And the captain told Ethan, with a hand on his shoulder and a smile that didn't match his eyes, "Some things are bigger than us. Let this one go." Ethan didn't let it go. He transferred the next week, walked out of narcotics without a backward glance, and took the first opening in the Bureau's counter-corruption unit because he wanted distance from the uniforms he once respected. He learned to read budgets the way soldiers read terrain. He learned to track bribes by the weight of missing commas. He learned the language of rot. Quiet, polite, and always wearing a badge. And slowly, deliberately, he hardened. Sophia was the only person who softened him again. She found him 5 years later, not in the ruins, but in the quiet spaces between them, and she taught him how to breathe without waiting for gunfire. She was the reason he bought the house in Pinecrest Heights. She was the reason he tried to heal. But healing never fully took. It stayed stitched at the edges, fragile, waiting for pressure. back in Charlotte that afternoon, while emergency lights flashed across the driveway and Sophia lay sedated in the hospital. Ethan sat in the quiet of their bedroom, trying to stitch two timelines together. The man he once was, and the man Pinecrest Heights had forced him to become again in a single morning. The magnolia blossoms outside moved in slow, heavy waves, but the inside of the room felt unnaturally still, like the world had paused to give him space to break. He didn't cry, he didn't pace, he didn't scream. He simply sat with his elbows on his knees and allowed the weight of the moment to settle. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Lila Voss calling from Quantico. Her voice, sharp as a scalpel and steady as a heartbeat, cut through the silence. I heard. She said, no introduction, no pity. Just two words that carried a decade of history between them. I'm coming tonight. Ethan didn't tell her no. He didn't tell her yes. He didn't need to. Lila always arrived exactly when the world shifted beneath his feet. When the line went dead. He allowed himself one long breath and stood up with the slow, deliberate precision of a man returning to a job he never wanted again. Across town. Caldwell sat in his garage with the door half open, sweaty and jittery, his police jacket tossed onto a dusty lawn chair. A half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon sat beside a toolbox. The oxy bottle rattled when he shook it, and he cursed when he realized he had fewer pills left than he remembered. He swallowed two anyway, leaned back, and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. His mind kept replaying the veranda, the look Ethan gave him, not fear, not anger, but a calm that scraped something raw inside him. That bastard thinks he's better than me. He muttered to the empty air, thinks he can walk around like he owns the place. He didn't tell Hale he'd pressed the gun harder than necessary. He didn't admit he wanted Ethan to twitch, to make a move, to give him an excuse, in Caldwell's world. Control had become the only thing keeping his life from splintering apart. Oxy fueled the nights when memories from deployment clawed at him. Pills quieted the guilt he never faced. Pills made him feel like a warrior again instead of a man drowning in his own failures. And when he patrolled Pinecrest Heights, the pills turned into a kind of righteous clarity. He was keeping the neighborhood right. He was making sure they didn't spread. He believed this even as his hands shook and his chest tightened. He believed it because the alternative would mean admitting he had become the exact predator he used to fight. Back in the hospital. Ethan sat beside Sophia's bed. Her skin looked pale under the fluorescent lights. A small machine beeped steadily beside her. The doctors had said the word he dreaded. Miscarriage. So gently it felt like a knife wrapped in cotton. A nurse came in and asked if he needed water. But Ethan only shook his head. When the door clicked shut again, the silence pressed closer. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Sophia's forehead. I'm right here, he whispered, even in sleep. Her face tightened as if the body remembered what the mind was trying to forget. He stayed like that for a long time, watching her breathe, letting the room fill with quiet promises he hadn't spoken yet. When he returned home that evening, the house felt wrong. Not unsafe, but wrong. Silence carried a different weight now. He walked through the rooms slowly, tracing the path Sophia had taken that morning. The kitchen, the hallway, the doorway where she had collapsed. The dried coffee stain still marked the floorboards. He crouched down, ran his thumb over it, and felt his breath catch in his chest. This was where their child had died, on a floor meant for family breakfasts and weekend mornings. He stood and looked out the window at the veranda. The same chair, the same table, the same blossoming tree, but the peace was gone. And with it, whatever faith he had left in badges, uniforms, or institutions, as dusk thickened. Ethan stepped outside and sat again in the exact spot where Caldwell had held the gun. He didn't flinch at the memory. He studied it, He dissected it. He folded it into the part of his mind where he kept things that had to be handled with precision. He wasn't looking for revenge in the crude, impulsive sense. He wasn't looking to break Caldwell with fists or fury. That kind of justice burned fast and died faster. Ethan wanted something colder, something that lasted, something that reached every hand, every pocket, every signature that made this neighborhood believe it could decide who belonged and who didn't. He looked at the street, the houses, the quiet facade of wealth and order, and he whispered to the warm, still air, "You brought this on yourselves." By the time the porch light clicked on automatically, Ethan had already made his choice. He wasn't going back to the man who once believed in badges. He was going back to the man who knew exactly how corruption worked, and how to pull every rotten board out of the structure until the whole thing collapsed. The man who stopped believing had returned. And Pinecrest Heights had no idea what that meant. Lila Voss arrived in Charlotte just after sunset, stepping out of the black Bureau sedan with the same quiet precision she'd used to dismantle corrupt sheriffs, city councils, and police unions for a decade. She moved like a storm wrapped in silk, controlled, cold, and absolutely sure of the damage she would inflict. When she walked through Ethan's front door, she didn't offer condolences or apologies. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Show me everything." There was no softness in her voice, only loyalty sharpened by years of battles fought side by side. Ethan led her to the living room where 3 laptops waited on the coffee table. Their neighbors in Pinecrest Heights, a retired surgeon, a tech CEO, and a former hedge fund manager, had all quietly slid him access codes to their Ring cameras the moment they'd learned what happened, not out of kindness, out of fear. If something this brutal could happen to Ethan, a seasoned federal agent with a clean record and a quiet life, then none of them were safe. Lila sat down without removing her coat, cracked open each feed, and scrubbed through the footage with her typical, clinical efficiency. "Angle 1, she said. The screen showed Caldwell stepping out of the patrol car, jaw clenched, hand already on his gun. Angle 2, Hale watching, waiting, the calculation in his eyes unmistakable. Angle 3, the most damning. The full view of Ethan seated on the veranda, relaxed, still reading the paper, unaware of the violence about to detonate against his life. Lila didn't blink as she watched Caldwell slam the gun into Ethan's skull or Sophia collapse in the doorway. She didn't flinch when the blood began to darken the wood beneath her. When the clip ended, she leaned back, exhaled, and tapped her finger against her thigh in a slow, rhythmic pattern Ethan recognized instantly. It was the sound she made when she had already started to build her attack. "We're going to bury them," she said quietly, as if discussing weather, "but we need every piece, every thread, every crack." Ethan opened a folder he hadn't shown Sophia, not because he was hiding it, but because he knew she couldn't bear the weight yet. Inside were 11 formal complaints filed against Officer Ryan Caldwell over the past 9 years, 8 for excessive force, 2 for unlawful detainment, 1 for a hospital-verified concussion on a 16-year-old Latino boy. Every single complainant was Black or Latino. Every single complaint had been marked unfounded. 11 victims, Lila murmured, flipping through the reports. And not one internal affairs review? That's not incompetence, that's infrastructure. Ethan nodded. He had been thinking the same thing since the morning. Caldwell wasn't a lone threat. He was a symptom, a soldier in a deeper machine built to target, intimidate, and erase. Lila looked up at Ethan and saw something in his eyes she had only seen once before. The night after his partner died. The same stillness, the same cold fire, the same refusal to let injustice go unpunished. She studied him for a long second and then turned to the table where the ultrasound photo still lay. The corner was stained with a small, rust-colored mark. Sophia's blood from the veranda. Lila's expression shifted, not outwardly, but in the way her jaw tightened and her eyes lowered. She picked up the photo gently. "Ethan," she said softly, "I'm so sorry." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence held every word he didn't yet have the strength to speak. They spent the next 2 hours cross-checking timestamps, lining up the 3 angles, matching Caldwell's arrival to Hale's radio logs, and mapping the exact moment Sophia collapsed. Lila built the timeline like a surgeon reconstructing bone fragments, precise, methodical, clinical. She paused only once. When the footage showed Caldwell turning his gun briefly toward Sophia as she fell. He pointed a weapon at a pregnant woman, she said, barely audible. Ethan nodded once. He didn't see a pregnant woman. He replied, "He saw a threat to the fantasy he thinks he's protecting." Lila shook her head. "No," she whispered. "He saw someone who didn't fit the blueprint." She clicked to the next frame. That's worse. Near 11 o'clock. Ethan opened a drawer and placed 3 additional files on the table. IA reports, disciplinary logs, and an anonymous statement accusing Caldwell of coercing witnesses in an assault case 4 years earlier. The statement was unsigned. Attached was a handwritten note. "Don't trust Kane. He decides who lives here." Lila lifted the page slowly. "Sergeant Victor Kane?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said, "the one they call the unofficial mayor of Pinecrest Heights." Lila knew that name. Everyone in counter-corruption did. Kane had been whispered about for years. A man who played both sides of the law, who controlled shifts, patrol assignments, and property disputes with the confidence of someone who believed the city silently belonged to him. This wasn't random. Lila said, "Caldwell didn't pick you. Kane did." Ethan looked back at the ultrasound photo again. Then Kane doesn't understand what he started. The house grew quiet again, heavy with a grief that hung in the air like smoke from a fire still smoldering. Ethan's gaze dropped to the table, where the ultrasound lay between them. 2 weeks earlier. Sophia had placed that photo on the refrigerator with a tiny magnet shaped like a magnolia blossom. They had joked about names. They had talked about which room would become the nursery. They had planned. They had believed. And now, that future lay in pieces at the feet of 2 men who had seen Ethan as an intruder in his own home. Lila touched the photo with one fingertip and then set it back down with a care that felt almost ceremonial. "Ethan," she said quietly, "what do you want?" Her voice held no fear, no hesitation, only truth. Ethan looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and lost too much. "I want them to taste loss," he said. His tone was so calm, so measured, that the words settled into the room like cold iron. Not the kind you feel in a courtroom. "The kind you remember every day you wake up?" Lila nodded, as if she had been expecting that answer. "Then we start with Caldwell," she said. "We expose every complaint they buried." She tapped the IA files. "Then we pull on Kane's threads until the whole net collapses." She glanced at her laptop. "And Hale?" "He's the weak link." His eyes gave him away. Ethan walked to the veranda door and looked outside. The magnolia tree swayed in the night breeze, its blossoms white as ghosts. "Hale," Ethan said, "is going to lead us straight to the rot." He rested his hand on the glass, the cold surface grounding him. "And when we get to the end of it, Lila, we're going to find who's been protecting them." Lila closed the final laptop, folded her coat over her arm, and stood beside him. She knew what Ethan meant. These weren't rogue officers. This was a structure, someone higher, someone with power. Someone with a vested interest in keeping Pinecrest Heights exactly the way it looked on paper. Clean, white, profitable. Ethan stared into the night, his voice low and steady. "They killed my child," he whispered. And they think this is over. Lila placed a hand on his arm. It's not over, she said. It's the first cut. And in the stillness that followed, Ethan made a silent promise to the magnolias swaying outside the window. This neighborhood would learn what it meant to take something from him. The first cut was the deepest, and the next would come soon. Sergeant Victor Kane watched the storm gather from the safety of his office. A cramped room wedged behind the Pinecrest Heights substation, where the blinds were always half closed and the faint smell of cigar smoke clung to the walls like a warning. He read the first incident report about the Harlow confrontation and saw immediately that Caldwell's sloppiness had finally crossed a line. Not a moral line. Kane didn't have those, but a strategic one. He needed the neighborhood quiet, controlled, predictable. And what Caldwell had done on that veranda wasn't a scare tactic. It was a bomb. Kane tapped the desk with 2 fingers, thinking through every angle. Ethan Harlow wasn't just another homeowner. He was bureau, connected, disciplined. The kind of man who didn't panic but documented. The kind of man who didn't shout but destroyed quietly. Kane knew that type all too well, because once, years ago, he'd been almost like that. Almost, before money, leverage, and blood rewrote him into something colder. He leaned back and lit a cigar, the smoke curling toward the ceiling as he reached for his phone. On the first ring, Officer Isabella Izzy Reyes answered, her voice tight, like a woman who had been living too long with a hand around her throat. Kane didn't bother with pleasantries. I need you in my office, he said. Now. She hesitated only a moment. I'm not on shift. Kane smiled without warmth. You are now? When Izzy arrived. He didn't offer her a seat. He simply turned his monitor to face her. On the screen played a grainy video. 16-year-old Izzy at a house party, holding a joint, laughing at something someone said off camera. She froze. He didn't need to say anything. The implication had been the same for years. Step out of line, and the video becomes evidence. Your custody battle collapses. Your 6-year-old autistic son goes into the system, and no one hears from you again. Kane leaned forward, voice soft and poisonous. Harlow's wife lost the baby today, he said. Izzy's eyes widened. She felt the air leave her chest. Sir, that doesn't matter. Kane cut in. What matters is that this needs to disappear like every other complaint. She shook her head slowly. I can't make that video go away. Everyone's talking about it. Kane stepped closer. Which is why you're going to make sure it stops being talked about. Understood? Her jaw trembled, but she nodded. Kane dismissed her with a flick of his hand, already dialing his next call, already weaving the next lie, already planning the next containment measure. But Izzy didn't drive home. She sat in her cruiser for almost 10 minutes, staring at her trembling hands, breathing through the rising panic that threatened to choke her. Sophia had lost her baby. And it was because of the same man Kane kept protecting, the same man whose name she'd been forced to defend in reports, the same man whose brutality she'd been ordered to justify. She thought about her son, small, gentle, nonverbal, terrified of loud sounds, and wondered what kind of world she was protecting if she let Kane bury this too. Her hands steadied, her breath smoothed. She made a choice, one that would cost her everything or save someone else's life. She tapped her phone, opened an encrypted folder she'd been building for months, and forwarded the cleanest, clearest veranda video to one person who would know exactly what to do with it. Elena Torres, investigative reporter at the Charlotte Observer, survivor, fighter, and the woman Kane had hurt 6 years earlier in a story that never saw daylight. Izzy hit send and whispered, "Please, let this be worth it." Elena received the file while sitting in her car outside the Observer's office, the late-night rain sliding down the windshield like streaks of silver. When she saw the sender, she whispered, "Izzy, what did you do?" But when she opened the video, everything inside her changed. The image of Caldwell ramming the gun into Ethan's skull, the sound of Sophia collapsing, the raw, unfiltered violence of it. Elena closed her eyes and felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from memory. 6 years earlier, Caldwell had assaulted her in the back of his cruiser after pulling her over for reckless driving. She had fought, screamed, clawed, but the report Kane filed described her as belligerent and resisting. The case evaporated. Her trauma did not. Seeing Ethan on that veranda reopened every wound she had stitched shut through force of will alone. She started her car and drove without thinking, the city lights streaking past like blurred ghosts. Ethan was on the veranda when she arrived, sitting in the same chair as that morning, staring into the darkness as if it were speaking to him. When Elena stepped out of her car, he didn't look up immediately. He recognized footsteps, the cadence of someone carrying a story heavy enough to bend their spine. "Ethan," she said quietly. He finally looked at her, eyes hollow but sharp. "Elena." She approached him slowly, as though crossing sacred ground. "A friend sent me something," she said, holding up the flash drive. "And I think it's time someone gave you the piece you're missing." Ethan motioned for her to sit, but she shook her head. "I'll stand," she said. "This is confession, not conversation." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Caldwell, Kane, Graves, they aren't just running a racket." She swallowed hard. "Kane ordered a witness killed in 2017, a 17-year-old girl. I wrote the story. It never made it to print. My editor got a call from City Hall that night. By morning, the file was gone, and so was she." Ethan's eyes darkened, a slow tightening of resolve behind them. "Why come now?" he asked. Elena exhaled, pulling strength from a place she'd buried for too long. "Because watching that video, watching Sophia fall, I realized something. They don't stop. They escalate. And if we let this one go, the next person who dies might not get the chance to fight back." Ethan took the drive from her hand. "What's on this?" he asked. "Everything I've gathered since the night Kane ruined my life," she said. "Ledgers, emails, audio clips, names you won't recognize yet, but you will." She paused. "There's also the full report from 2017, the one the city erased." Ethan looked toward the magnolias, their pale petals catching the glow of the front porch light. "Why bring it to me?" he asked. Elena's voice softened. "Because you're the first person they hit who has the power, and the will, to burn them down. And because I've waited 6 years to ruin that man." They didn't speak for a moment. The night felt heavy enough to press into the skin. Ethan turned the drive in his hand once, then again, making a decision that would change every life in Pinecrest Heights. "Elena," he said, "I'm going to make them feel what they did. Every single one of them." She nodded. "Then you're going to need this." She reached into her coat, pulled out a small envelope, and pressed it into his palm. "It's the one thing Kane would kill to keep buried." She stepped back, her breath visible in the cool air. "And Ethan, once you open that envelope, there's no way back." He held her gaze, steady and unwavering. There wasn't any way back after this morning. Elena left without another word, the taillights fading down the hill. Ethan stood alone on the veranda, the envelope in one hand and the flash drive in the other. The magnolia blossoms moved gently in the October breeze, their white petals glowing under the porch light like quiet witnesses. Ethan looked out over the neighborhood that had tried to erase him and whispered to the night, "The devil you know is finally out of time." Rain began falling over Charlotte just after midnight, soft at first, then harder, beating against the streets like a warning the city didn't yet understand, in a dim motel room off Independence Boulevard. Izzy Reyes sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, with her hands shaking so violently she had to clench them to keep from unraveling. Her 6-year-old son, Mateo, slept curled on the blanket beside her, small and warm, unaware of the catastrophe about to swallow their lives. She had done the unthinkable, sent the veranda footage to a reporter. She had crossed Kane, and Kane never forgave betrayal. She kept telling herself she'd made the right choice, that helping Ethan and Sophia was worth whatever came next. But when her phone buzzed at 12:17 a.m., a single message turned her blood to ice. "We have the boy. Sit tight. No signature. No threat. Just certainty." Izzy lunged for Mateo, but the bed was empty. A scream tore from her chest, raw and animal, the kind that breaks something inside a person. She spun around the room, checked the bathroom, checked the parking lot through the blinds. Nothing. The door hadn't been forced. The lock wasn't broken. Kane's men had used a master key. They were ghosts, efficient, practiced. She fell against the wall, unable to breathe. Her mind crawling into dark corners she refused to enter. Her son, her gentle, terrified child who couldn't handle loud noises, was in the hands of a man who had ordered murders as easily as ordering takeout. She grabbed her phone, ready to call 911. But her screen lit up again. 1 hour, drive north. You know where? She did. The abandoned textile plant off I-277. The same place Kane had taken her 6 years ago when he first showed her the video he used as leverage. Izzy's body shook so violently she almost dropped the phone. She whispered Mateo's name again and again, as if the sound alone might pull him back. Across town at Ethan's house. Lila had been watching traffic cameras 3 blocks from the motel where Izzy had been staying. Her instincts had told her Izzy wouldn't be safe. Not after helping Elena. Not after what Kane had to protect. When she saw a black, unmarked van pulling away from the motel at 12:10 a.m., moving too fast. Headlights off. She didn't wait for confirmation. "Ethan," she said, already grabbing her coat. They took the boy. Ethan didn't ask how she knew. He simply stood, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing with the calm that always came before he stepped into danger. He grabbed his keys, and the two were out the door before the porch light even flickered. The rain grew harder, turning the streets into streaked mirrors as they sped through the city. Ethan called Izzy, and she answered on the first ring. "They have him," she cried, voice cracking, breath heaving. "Ethan, they took my baby." He spoke softly, but his voice carried the weight of iron. "Listen to me. Izzy, we're coming. Tell me where." When she told him, Lila closed her eyes. Kane's playground. She murmured, "Of course." Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. No more shadows. He said, "Tonight we drag him into the light." The textile plant loomed like a rusted skeleton against the storm, its broken windows glowing faintly from the headlights of the van parked near the loading dock. Ethan killed the lights on his car and coasted to a stop 100 yards away. Lila checked her pistol, adjusted her holster, and nodded once. Ethan didn't move immediately. He looked at the structure, studied the patterns, counted the silhouettes moving near the van. 4 men. Confident. Too confident. "They think she'll come alone," he whispered. "Good." Rain drenched his hair as the two slipped into the shadows, moving around the far side of the building. Izzy arrived minutes later, soaked, trembling, barely able to stand. She stumbled toward the van, screaming Mateo's name, but Hale stepped out from behind a pillar, expression cold, gun drawn. The same high school friend Ethan once trusted, now reduced to Kane's obedient weapon. "You should have kept your mouth shut." "Izzy," Hale said, "this is on you." She dropped to her knees, hands out, sobbing. "Please, he's all I have." Please. Hale's jaw twitched. Regret or calculation? No one could tell. Bring her. He ordered the others. Kane wants a message delivered. They didn't get far. A low whistle sliced through the rain. The men turned. Ethan stepped from behind a stack of pallets. Lila beside him, both steady, both armed, both radiating the kind of resolve that makes predators hesitate. Let the boy go, Ethan said, voice calm, deadly calm. Hale blinked, stunned. Ethan? There was a flicker of something human in his face, a memory trying to surface. But Kane's grip had been in him too long. You shouldn't be here, Hale said. Lila's gun stayed locked on the nearest man. We're exactly where we need to be. Then the chaos erupted. One of Kane's men lunged for Izzy. Ethan fired a warning shot that ricocheted off the metal column beside him, and the man froze. The van door slammed open from the inside. Mateo stood there, shaking, small headphones over his ears. Kane's men had put them on him to keep him quiet. Ethan stepped forward. It's okay, buddy, he said gently. We're getting you home. But Hale, cornered and unraveling, grabbed Izzy and shoved his gun against her ribs. Nobody moves, he shouted, voice cracking. Lila didn't blink. You don't want this, she said. You're already drowning. Put the gun down. Hale's breath shook. Rain streamed down his face, and then something inside him broke. Not cleanly, but like splintered wood giving way. Izzy moved first, twisting her weight just enough to pull Hale off balance. His gun fired once, the sound echoing across the empty plant. But the bullet struck the ground. Ethan lunged, disarming Hale with a single precise strike, pinning him to the wet concrete. The other two men tried to run, but Lila's voice cut through the storm like a blade. Don't. They stopped, dropped their weapons. The night turned silent except for rain hitting metal, and Izzy sobbing as she held Mateo tight against her chest, whispering that she loved him, that he was safe, that she would never let anyone hurt him again. Ethan stood over Hale, breathing hard. You took a child, he said quietly. You crossed a line you can't come back from. Hale closed his eyes, tears mixing with rain. Kane made me, he whispered. He owns everything. The ledgers, the tapes, the orders. You don't understand how deep it goes. Ethan stared at him, expression cold as stone. Then you're going to tell me everything. Izzy approached, wiping her face, still trembling but steady enough to speak. Ethan, she said, voice breaking. I'll trade it. Everything I have, every file, every ledger, every recording, even the 2017 murder order, just, please, keep my son safe. Ethan looked at her, rain running down his face, and nodded once. Your boy is safe, he said softly. And tonight, Izzy, you just gave me the knife to cut this whole thing open. They stood in the storm, the four of them, Ethan, Lila, Izzy, and the shaking child in her arms, while Charlotte burned quietly in the background, unaware that this was the night the city's darkest secrets would finally be dragged into the light. And as thunder rolled across the sky, Ethan looked down at Hale and whispered, This ends now. Charlotte woke up angry, not irritated, not outraged, angry in a way that rattled storefront glass and made city leaders sweat through their shirts before breakfast. Elena Torres had dropped the bomb at dawn, 3 ring camera angles from Ethan's veranda, the hospital report confirming Sophia's miscarriage, the ledger showing $2 million in quiet transfers to Pinecrest patrol units, and, worst of all, the audio recording of Sergeant Victor Kane ordering the 2017 hit on a 17-year-old girl. The city didn't just react, it ignited. 10 straight days of marches down Tryon Street. 10 straight nights of chants echoing off the glass towers. Church mothers locking arms with students. Veterans standing beside teachers. Every race, every age, every neighborhood, shoulder to shoulder, demanding justice, and at the center of the storm, Ethan watched everything unfold with a calm that was almost unnerving. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was purpose, pure, cold purpose, because every chant, every headline, every protest sign with Sophia's name on it brought him closer to the reckoning he'd promised. Meanwhile, Kane vanished. Hale turned state's witness within 24 hours, handing over statements, locations, passwords, and audio files with the desperation of a man who understood he'd been working for someone who wouldn't hesitate to burn him alive to save himself. Graves, the beloved grandfather police chief, tried to hold a press conference, but the crowd's roar drowned him out before he said 10 words. His hands trembled on live television. He looked like a man who knew the walls were closing. But Caldwell unraveled differently. His collapse wasn't public. It was private, slow, smeared with guilt and pills and the kind of fear that eats a man from the inside out. He spent the first 2 days hiding in his garage again, staring at his shaking hands, replaying the moment Sophia fell, replaying Ethan's eyes, replaying everything he'd told himself didn't matter. On the 3rd night, he smashed every mirror in his house. By the 5th, he was sleeping with the lights on. On the 7th night, soaked in sweat and bourbon, he drove to Ethan's street at 3 in the morning. The neighborhood was dark except for a few porch lights flickering in the rain. Ethan was awake. He'd known someone was coming. He felt it before he heard the tires on the wet pavement. Caldwell stepped out of the car with his gun shaking in his hand. Not aimed, not controlled, just shaking. His face was pale. His eyes were wild with the kind of terror that comes only when a man realizes the world sees him clearly at last. Ethan opened the door before Caldwell knocked. No weapon, no armor. Just the steady gaze of a man who had already walked through hell and come back with a ledger of his own. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain pattered softly on the roof. The magnolia branches swayed. Caldwell swallowed hard, his voice cracking when he finally found it. I never meant... I didn't think she'd... His breath hitched. I didn't know. Ethan stepped forward, close enough to touch the barrel if he wanted. You pointed a gun at my wife, he said, voice calm, steady, almost gentle. You didn't care who she was. You didn't even see her. Caldwell shook his head, jaw trembling. I can't sleep, he said. I hear her fall every time I close my eyes. I hear her hit the floor. I see your face. I see... He trailed off, unable to finish. Ethan studied him with an expression not of anger, but of truth. Cold, sharp truth. Ryan, he said quietly, you think this ends with a bullet. But your punishment isn't death. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice until Caldwell could feel the words against his skin. Your punishment is living long enough to face what you've done. The sentence hit Caldwell like a strike. His knees buckled. Tears spilled down his face, not the tears of remorse, but the tears of a man whose lies had finally collapsed. His gun slipped from his hand and clattered onto the porch. For a long moment, he knelt there, shaking, the rain soaking through his uniform. Ethan stepped back, letting the silence wrap around them like a verdict. Then Caldwell whispered the words no one expected. I'm going to turn myself in. Ethan nodded once. Good. He said, do it before the sun comes up. Caldwell rose slowly, shoulders slumped, face broken in a way that made him look older than his 50 years. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't deserve it. He walked back to his car, got in, and drove straight to the federal building downtown. By sunrise, he was in handcuffs, demanding to make a full confession, and while Caldwell surrendered, the city continued to roar. Elena released more tapes. Lila delivered the ledgers directly to the U.S. attorney. Izzy met with investigators, hands trembling, voice steady, laying out every detail she had kept buried. Within hours, federal warrants swept through Pinecrest Heights and the substation. Hale was taken into protective custody. Kane was cornered in a mountain cabin outside Asheville, screaming threats into the wind as agents dragged him out barefoot. Graves collapsed during his arrest, clutching his chest. The city watched all of it unfold like a live documentary, every screen illuminated with justice. But the image Charlotte talked about most wasn't the arrests. It wasn't the ledgers. It wasn't even the tapes. It was the sight of Ryan Caldwell, once untouchable, once feared, once the iron fist of Pinecrest Heights, walking out of the federal building in handcuffs at 7 a.m., escorted by 2 U.S. Marshals. His eyes hollow, his lips trembling, his entire world stripped down to the truth Ethan had spoken into him. A crowd gathered on the sidewalk. Some jeered, some clapped, some simply recorded. Ethan wasn't among them. He was home with Sophia, sitting beside her hospital bed as she slept, her hand resting in his. He didn't need to see Caldwell fall. He had already delivered the sentence. The city would later call it the public execution, not because anyone died, but because it was the first time Charlotte saw what true accountability looked like. Raw, unfiltered, undeniable, and as the news broadcast Caldwell's walk again and again, Ethan held Sophia's hand and whispered the same words he had spoken on the veranda the night before. It's over. The worst of it is over. But he knew, deep down, that the final reckoning was still coming. Kane, Graves, Langford, the machine behind the badge. Those men hadn't tasted justice yet, but they would, and when they did, it would be just as public and far more devastating. The federal courthouse in Charlotte felt heavier than usual on the morning the trial began, as if the building itself understood the weight of what was coming. Reporters crowded the steps, clergy led quiet prayers on the sidewalk, and the families of those long buried beneath Pinecrest Heights corruption filled every bench they could find. Ethan arrived through the side entrance with Lila beside him, their steps slow, measured, solemn. Sophia walked between them, her hand in Ethan's, her body still healing, her spirit steadier than anyone expected. She wore a plain navy dress, no jewelry, no makeup, just the quiet resolve of a woman who had lost everything and still showed up to watch justice breathe. Inside the courtroom, Izzy sat alone in the witness waiting area, clutching a small crayon drawing her son had made the night before. A stick figure with headphones and a big smile. She pressed it to her chest, inhaled deeply, and whispered, "For you, Mateo." When the bailiff called her name, she stood, smoothed her blouse, and walked forward with the posture of someone who had finally stopped running. Her testimony was the blade that split the courtroom open. She spoke about the ledgers, the bribe exchanges, Kane's threats, the blackmail, the hidden video files, the night they kidnapped Mateo, and the years she spent swallowing fear like broken glass. She didn't cry. She didn't stutter. She didn't hesitate. Every word struck like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading, widening, touching every corner of the room. And when she finished, when her voice finally softened at the edge of exhaustion, the silence that followed was not shock. It was reverence. The jury saw her not as an officer, or a whistleblower, or a mother desperate to protect her child. They saw her as the truth walking in human form. Then came the defendants. Caldwell sat hunched, thinner, pale, consumed by the weight of the confession he'd made. He didn't look at Ethan. He didn't look at Sophia. He didn't look at anyone. When asked if he wished to address the court, he stood with trembling hands and said only, "I'm sorry. I deserve whatever comes." It was the first honest thing he'd said in years. Kane, shackled and furious, tried to snarl his way into control, shouting about conspiracies and false witnesses, until the judge ordered him silenced and removed. The courtroom doors closed behind him with a finality that felt almost biblical. Graves, once the smiling grandfather on TV, looked small, sunken cheeks, shaking hands, eyes darting between attorneys as if searching for a hole to crawl into. For a man who had pocketed over $4 million, he looked like someone who had lost everything that made him recognizable. And in a way, he had. The masks were gone. The rot was exposed. The machine was dead. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury returned. The room held its breath as the foreperson stood. On all counts, she began, her voice steady, we find the defendants guilty. Caldwell, 22 years. Hale, 9. Graves, 12. Reduced by age and poor health. Kane, life without parole. Kane didn't live long enough to serve more than 9 days. He hanged himself in his cell using his shoelaces, leaving behind a single line scribbled on the back of an intake form. The city was mine. No one mourned him, not even the men he once commanded. Graves suffered a heart attack 3 months into his sentence, dying penniless in a federal medical unit. The city barely paused before moving on. What Pinecrest Heights had built over 17 years collapsed in less than 2. And yet, the destruction felt strangely quiet, like a fever breaking. 1 year later, the magnolias bloomed earlier than usual. Pinecrest Heights smelled of fresh grass, warm sunlight, and something softer, relief. Ethan sat on the same veranda where everything had begun. The wood replaced, the railing repainted, the shadows gentler now. Sophia stepped out with their newborn daughter tucked against her shoulder, wrapped in a soft white blanket crocheted by Ethan's mother. The baby made a small cooing sound as Sophia lowered herself into the chair beside him. Ethan looked at them. Sophia, whole and glowing, and their daughter, tiny and perfect, a miracle born from a season of ashes, and felt something settle in place inside him. Not closure, something deeper, something steadier. She likes the air out here, Sophia whispered, brushing a small curl from the baby's forehead. She's been calm since we stepped outside. Ethan smiled faintly. She has good instincts, he said. Sophia leaned her head against his shoulder. Are you ready for today? She asked. He nodded. The city was unveiling a memorial downtown for the victims whose names had been buried under Pinecrest Heights corruption. Izzy was speaking. Elena was covering it. Lila was driving them. It would be a day of remembering, a day of honoring, a day of honesty. But for this moment, before the noise returned. Ethan lifted his daughter in his arms and held her close, breathing in the quiet sweetness of her skin. The magnolia blossoms drifted across the lawn, bright white against the grass, soft as snowflakes. The baby blinked up at him, eyes calm, unburdened by the darkness that had shaped the months before her arrival. Ethan kissed her forehead and whispered words he had carried, heavy and deliberate, for over a year. The veranda never forgives, he murmured, but it remembers who fought for it. Sophia closed her eyes, letting the breeze brush against her face. The house felt different now. Not haunted, not broken, just lived in, marked by pain, shaped by justice, softened by renewal. As the wind moved through the magnolia branches, as the petals floated down like blessings, as the baby curled against Ethan's chest with a peaceful sigh, the world around them felt finally, balanced. Justice had not erased their grief. It had not restored what was lost, but it had carved space for something new to grow, something honest, something earned. And for the first time since that terrible morning, Ethan allowed himself to breathe without bracing for pain. The fight was over, the reckoning complete, the future theirs again. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps these stories reach more people.